TV Guide, America's Time Capsule, was presented by Mitchell Hadley at the Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention on Thursday, September 13th, 2018, in Hunt Valley, Maryland.
Good morning, everyone. I will respect everybody's time, especially the next speaker, by starting on time here. And I appreciate having the air conditioner turned down a little bit, although secretly I was kind of hoping it would stay on because I want to make sure that everybody stays awake. Otherwise, if you fall asleep, then I'm afraid there's only one person who can be responsible for that. But I'd like to thank you all for coming this morning. My name is Mitchell Hadley, and my topic today is TV Guide, America's Time Capsule. Now, just a word of introduction. I'm described in the program as a TV historian, and you probably wonder how someone gets to be a TV historian. Well, in my case, there were two ways of doing it. One is that I've watched TV for over 50 years. It started when I was very little, and I think that when you have watched or done anything for 50 years, you count as an expert. And the other is because somebody linked to one of my articles on Wikipedia and referred to me as a TV historian. And we all know that Wikipedia is an absolutely 100% dependable source. And so if Wikipedia says that I'm a historian, I'm a TV historian. But I'll let you be the judge when we're all done with this. What do I mean by TV Guide being a time capsule? Well, I think it's simple. A lot of you are probably used to going around and seeing things like the New York Times or Time magazine or different kinds of newspapers or magazines where you can buy the issue from the day you were born. And presumably this is to tell you everything that was going on and what the world was like on the day you were born. I would say the TV Guide is at least as dependable as these other sources for being able to do that. Because not only do you find out what programs were on, and those programs are going to reflect the culture of the time, but you also find out through the articles what people were interested in, who the hot celebrities were, what the rumors are about shows that you might be looking forward to seeing in the upcoming fall season. And we can look at those today and say that some of them are very famous, some of them disappeared without a trace. And the other part of it, which I'll spend some time on in this presentation, is reading letters to the editor, because I think there's no better judge of how people feel at a given time than reading a letter to the editor, especially when you had to sit down, write it out, fold it up, put it in an envelope, address the envelope, stamp it, and walk down to the mailbox and mail it. It wasn't like sending an email or commenting online. You actually had to do something. And because of that, it's people who felt strongly that would write in with letters to the editor. And we'll see some interesting examples of that. But I wanted to start first with what you see here. That's the first cover of the first issue of TV Guide. And that is probably the most famous baby in America on the cover. That's Desi Arnaz Jr. His mother was Lucille Ball. His father was Desi Arnaz Sr. And that is just the first example of how TV Guide is on top of what is going on. When Desi Jr. was born, he was born by cesarean so that they made sure that he would be born the same night as Lucy gave birth on her TV show. And it was such an event that it overshadowed what happened the next day, which was January 20th, 1953, which just happened to be the inauguration of Dwight Eisenhower as president. But who was interested in that when you had Lucy giving birth? Just an example here. Now, one of the things that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on today is the history of TV Guide. That's an interesting topic itself, everything from how TV Guide got to be a national publication to how they kept track of all the listings for the shows that they would have in each issue. It's a fascinating topic. And this book here, which I'm not sure if you can read the title, it's called Changing Channels, America in TV Guide, by Glenn Altshuter and David Grossvogel. And it's a very good book. And if any of you are interested in finding out really how TV Guide became the magazine that it became, this would be a terrific place to start. I have it in my book shelf, and I did steal a few things from that, but I think it's a very good book. This is also an excellent book, if you don't mind my saying so, since I wrote it. It's called The Electronic Mirror, and it just coincidentally happens to be on sale today through Saturday, the actual dates of the convention. And I will be downstairs selling my book, autographing copies, making paper airplanes from it if that's what you might be interested in. But I hope you do check it out. It's a book of essays on how classic television really explains to us today about who we were and who we are and everything in between. And what it really does, and what this presentation today will be doing in part, is showing us how classic television reflects all of this, how you can learn about the history of this country, culturally and otherwise, through classic television, and how it helps us to explain how we got to where we are and who we are today. And one of the things I mention on the back of the cover is, and this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in classic TV and why I think more people should be, and why I think that classic TV deserves more historical credibility among scholars than it does. It's because television is our history. No matter when we were born, no matter what TV we're talking about, it's our history because it tells us not only who we were then, but it tells us who we are today, and to a great extent it tells us just how we got there. So that's kind of the theme here, and that's what I try to talk about in this book, and I hope that you will be considerate and check it out afterwards. So, what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the subjects that I've said. It's kind of hard to know where to start. Do you go chronologically? Do you go by subject? What do you go by? Well, we're just going to have a little bit of everything, so I'm just going to start somewhere in the middle with something that I think does a pretty good job of explaining how TV Guide explained things to us. And at this point, it's good to remember that TV Guide is not the same magazine that you see today, even though it has the same logo and it calls itself TV Guide. The TV Guide of the 50s through the 70s was kind of a combination of Entertainment Weekly and National Review, with a bit of the Wall Street Journal maybe thrown in besides. It was a magazine that took television seriously and felt you should take television seriously, and it felt that television should be taken as a document of what was going on, not just merely entertainment. And many of the people that wrote for TV Guide had that same feeling, that television should be something that could make us smarter, it could make us better citizens, it could make the United States a better country. And if you were here for the early presentation on NBC's programs Today, Home, and Tonight, that's kind of the same thing that Pat Weaver would talk about, that there was a certain responsibility that television had. And so I think we'll touch a little bit on that as we go along as well. Now, this is Ronald Reagan in November of 1958. At this point, he is mostly done with his movie career. He is the host of General Electric Theater and occasional star. But because he is the commercial spokesman for GE, he makes a lot of public appearances for them. He tours the country talking not only to GE plants, but now to clubs, churches, chambers of commerce, all kinds of different civic groups. And he's refining and polishing a message that he has talking about common sense in America. And people are really impressed by what he has to say. And not just about General Electric, not about TV, but about the way things are. Well, What this is, of course, is the nascent beginning of his political campaign, although he didn't realize it, very few people realized it, but he had the opportunity to touch people in a way that most politicians don't get. And a lot of people came away from those meetings thinking Ronald Reagan was really, really something. They got to see him in a way that they didn't on TV. So when Reagan eventually does enter politics, runs for governor and wins, runs for president and eventually wins, a lot of people on the coasts were surprised by that. If they had read TV Guide, they wouldn't have been, because they met the people who wound up voting for him. And I think that's important. Also a sidelight here. One of the reasons Reagan's on the cover is because he is starring in this week's episode, which is called A Turkey for the President. Now, it would be nice to say that he was the president in this episode. It would really bring things around, but he's not. Instead, his son has a prize turkey, and he has just found out that his prize turkey is going to be the guest of the President of the United States for Thanksgiving dinner, if you know what I mean. Now, this is John F. Kennedy the next year in November of 1959. He's still a senator. He's not yet announced that he's going to be a candidate for president the following year. You didn't do that back then. He doesn't have to announce until January or February of the election year itself. But he's talking about how television is a force that has changed the political scene, and how the successful politician is going to have to learn how to use television. And one of the statistics he cites in his article, or maybe Ted Sorensen wrote it, I'm not sure, but it's very true nonetheless. Woodrow Wilson destroyed his health campaigning for the League of Nations, made 40 speeches in 3 weeks of hard travel, and eventually became a ruined man. President Eisenhower can reach several million people at once through one 15-minute speech without leaving the Oval Office. Kennedy understood what the direction of politics was going to be. Now, this is following President Kennedy's assassination, and I've got this up here. It's not immediately obvious, but I think it's fascinating, and I think it's an example of how you can leaf through the pages in TV Guide and find out what is going on, even when they don't tell you. This is the Army-Navy game from November 29th. It was originally scheduled for the 29th, but most of the games that were scheduled for November 23rd, the day following the assassination, were postponed to the following week, and therefore the games that were scheduled on the 29th were postponed to the following week. So this one, if you can't read it, it just says Army's Cadets versus Navy's Midshipmen at Philadelphia Stadium. This is the same listing from the following week, and it's almost identical except for the opening sentence. It says, Army's Cadets versus Navy's Midshipmen at Philadelphia Stadium. President Lyndon B. Johnson is expected to attend this game. Now, that's one of the first in-print references you will see to President Johnson, other than in a political sense or following the assassination itself. And you can imagine how the Secret Service must have felt about him going into a stadium with 100,000 people less than 3 weeks after his predecessor had been assassinated riding in a car through an American city. The other interesting thing about this is that the game is being played in Philadelphia Stadium. The next year, in November of 1964, that game is being played in John F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium. This is the article that, or the special issue that TV Guide put out January of '64, entirely devoted to the television coverage of the assassination. And I think to this day, this is probably the best pictorial review of what happened, filled with pictures, filled with stories of what's gone on, and just devoted itself completely to what had happened during what everybody called the 4 dark days. It included a special foreword by President Johnson. Now, 1964 was a campaign year, and the conventions were coming up, so it's no surprise the TV Guide would have a feature on Nancy Dickerson, who is one of the premier political reporters for NBC News. She was, in fact, one of the first serious female reporters, And she was the one who broke the news in Atlantic City that Lyndon Johnson was going to name Hubert Humphrey as his running mate. She broke the news. So, of course, when TV Guide wants to cover this, they talk about not her qualities as a journalist, they use her for a fashion shoot to show what the well-dressed anchor woman, or girl reporter as they used to call them, is wearing today. And that's a pink and white checkered number by Gustave Dessau. And I think the navy one in the middle is by Yves Saint Laurent. But that shows a little bit of a difference in how those things are covered by the time you get to a newswoman, say, like Barbara Walters. Now, what this leads into is the TV Guide did talk a lot about news. It talked about television, but it did so in conjunction with what was going on. Here's a show that was very popular in the 50s. It's called I Led 3 Lives, and it was about a man who was an ordinary businessman who was pretending to be a communist, but at the same time he had infiltrated a communist cell and was reporting back to the FBI. So there are his 3 lives. And this kind of show was a hallmark of programming in the 50s and the early 60s. You'll see it in TV Guide all the time. So what you see in TV Guide here is a uniform one outlook on us versus them in the Cold War. And it's very interesting to see how it is us versus them. This article is from January of 1966. And again, they're talking about Vietnam. And this is not something that an ordinary entertainment publication would be likely to be doing. But one of their correspondents, Eileen Saarinen, had traveled through Vietnam. And so in January of 1966, and to put this in perspective, in January of 66, a majority of students, college students, still supported the Vietnam War. So it wasn't what it became. But TV Guide is reporting on it anyway, and she's talking about this, I felt hope and hopelessness. This is later in 1966, the cover story, Neil Hickey talking about how television is covering the Vietnam War. And what it says, is TV giving us the picture? So he's over there, he's talking about with troops, he's talking with newsmen, he's talking with politicians. Is television presenting an accurate guide to what's going on in Vietnam? Well, in order to be able to tell, you have to know what's going on in Vietnam. And that's partly what he's doing. He's talking about the war, then he's talking about TV and the way it's covering it. Pete Seeger in February of 1968 is on the Smothers Brothers. So again, here is a case of a very famous program that you're looking at in the pages of TV Guide and remembering when this became a big deal. Pete Seeger had been on the Smothers Brothers in late 1967. By this time, the tide of the war has turned. And there was a song that he sang called Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. Now, Lyndon Johnson didn't like this. It was an anti-war song. It was, in the context that it was presented, clearly being aimed at him. And he supposedly complained to CBS. CBS cut the song from the show. And, of course, drew more attention to it than they would have if they had simply ignored it. But this is Seeger's triumphant return to the Smothers Brothers in February of '68, where he's going to be allowed to sing the song and it's going to be shown on the program. This is February 24th. On March 31st of that year, Lyndon Johnson announces he will not be running for re-election to the presidency. A good idea of what the tenor of the times was. This one I don't really need to comment on. But again, even in the new format of TV Guide, an issue that tells you exactly what's going on in the country. Let's go to something a little more lighthearted here. You remember that issue that I talked about, the memorial tribute to JFK? Well, there is a non-JFK article in that issue, and it's talking about the shows that are coming up in 1964 that you might be interested in. Here's one that they're talking about. It's a show called Gilligan, which stars Bob Denver, formerly Maynard on Dobie Gillis, and it's set in Hawaii. I wonder whatever happened to that show. Has anybody heard of it? This is the original broadcast of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer from December 5th of 1964. And I think if you go to any of the presentations that Rick Goldschmidt's going to be giving this weekend, you'll hear more about that. But that's a full-color page, full-color ad in the issue for the cartoon, and then the close-up that talked about it. No idea that this is going to become a classic that is still going to be on TV today. This is another classic. This is the first time that A Charlie Brown Christmas was aired on television. And what's interesting about this is that Charles Schulz did this cartoon especially for TV Guide to serve as a 2-page teaser for the cartoon. So you won't see this anywhere else but in TV Guide, unless today you might be looking at a collection of Schulz's work. But it was exclusive to the magazine. It's another one that becomes a classic, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. And again, what I find interesting about these is that they are presented without the knowledge that you and I have today. We know that these cartoons became classics. We know that they are part of our childhood and part of the childhood of our children and so on. They didn't know any of that at the time. So we're getting to see something that might be a big hit, or it might not. This first Super Bowl in 1967, and something that's interesting about this, nobody had any idea really whether or not this would be successful. It was either going to be a really big game that revolutionized TV, or it was going to be a total bust. The game wasn't a sellout, but what I find interesting about this ad is that there's a popular misconception that the Super Bowl name itself didn't come along until later on, and it is true that the first few games were formally called AFL NFL World Championship Game. But what these ads show is that from the very beginning, it was informally known as the Super Bowl. No Roman numerals yet, but this is the Super Bowl the way it's being advertised. This is the big Elvis comeback special, and this was his very first television appearance. It's on NBC in December of 1968, part of the holiday programming. It doesn't have a holiday theme, but it's the specials that networks used to unveil in December. Now, why am I showing these last few things? Again, if you wanted to tell somebody what was hot in pop culture back in the 50s and the 60s, what our pop culture was like, here's the example for you. You've got these big-time Christmas cartoons. You have the dawning of a brand new football game that's going to become a cultural institution. You've got Elvis Presley. This is really telling us, I think, what it's like at the time. Here's a cover of January of 1977. This is for Roots. And nobody knew, again, that Roots was going to become the sensation it was. One of the reasons that ABC scheduled it on consecutive nights was because they were afraid it was going to be a bomb. And if it was a bomb, because they weren't sure if America would really be interested in looking at the story of a black American family. If it was a bomb, they'd get it all out of the way in 1 week. But they did promote it. They did show a lot of commercials for it, so they wanted it to be a success. But they were prepared just in case. Now, you probably remember these. These are the ads that were the little cardboard sections in the middle of the TV guide. And they were always for record clubs, 8-track tapes, Book of the Month Club, eventually videos, DVDs, VHS. But this shows you what was hot back in the day. This is from December of '63, and I think we all agree that you don't want to miss that George Maharis album when it comes out. Here's another one that tells you how you too can enjoy a swinging teen party. You've got Bobby Vinton up there, Jan and Dean, Dion, all hits. Now, by this time, we're in the 70s, and now we've moved on to tapes. 11 records or tapes, and it's 8-track, of course. So who are the big ones there? You've got Donnie and Marie, you've got Kiss, you've even got ZZ Top back then. But this is a great way of seeing whether you're talking about the successful entertainers or with Book of the Month Club, what the best-selling books were. There they are. A lot of people, me included, I used to rip those out and rip out the little card and just play with them. So if you go to a used bookstore or an antique store and find a TV guide from the era that actually has those still in them, it's kind of a special bonus, and it shows that it was somebody, unlike me, somebody discerning that knew that they were obviously had something important. They said, someday this issue is going to be worth $5. Now, these are tracing some of the pop culture aspects of whatever time they come from. These are 3 covers from the late 60s and early 1970. The first one is by Andy Warhol. Did a cover for TV Guide, also did some of the layout from the inside of TV Guide. That's Barbara Feldon from Get Smart on the cover, and you probably recognize that from his Marilyn Monroe, Campbell's Soup Can era of work. The middle one is from Salvador Dali, who has a truly bizarre interview on the inside with Edith Ephron, who's a serious journalist who you can tell all through the interview is struggling to keep track of Dali as it goes on. And the one on the right is by Norman Rockwell, and that's of Johnny Carson. So Rockwell was the king of magazine covers, and it's kind of appropriate that he's doing the king of late night television there. But over the years, you've also got Leroy Neiman, Peter Max, Al Hirschfield. So you've got big-time, very well-known artists who do covers for TV Guide. It's very interesting. This is an ad on the back of TV Guide, which is usually where they have the tobacco advertisements. I don't think this one had passed muster today because it's politically incorrect. Especially there's a line in there that say, Confucius say, don't knock it till you've tried it. Again, it tells you a lot about how we did or didn't think at the time. Roger Maris had just broken Babe Ruth's home run record when this ad appeared in the World Series issue of 1961. There were no playoffs back in the day, so the World Series started in October, and Maris had just broken the most iconic record in all of professional sports. So you can see that he was a big deal back then. This is for one of the cereals that you don't see anymore. It's called Twinkles, and I don't know if anybody remembers that. You do. Good man. I did not. But you saw those kinds of ads all the time, and often that's about all you ever see of these products anymore. This is a kind of a fun little ad here, how you can go door to door. If you're a young boy who wants to become a real entrepreneur and a businessman, you can go door to door delivering TV Guide in your neighborhood, just like a newspaper. I never got TV Guide that one. I don't know if anybody remembers ever having it delivered to your door. This is an ad I like because it is so of the time. This is from November of '62. And as you can see, there's a pleasure that lingers long after you call long distance. A long distance call used to be a really big deal. It only happened on very special occasions. And since this issue is coming out around Thanksgiving time, one of those special occasions is coming up. So it kind of puts you in the mind, maybe there's somebody you'd like to call. I wonder who she had just gotten the call from. I like to think maybe it was her boyfriend at college or a relative that had called from Chicago, something like that. A very evocative ad, though. I just love it. I like this, too. This is an ad for Christmas lights from General Electric. It just reminds us of how colorful that era was. You had color TV coming in. You had the saturated color on television, and the ads were no different. But just remember, don't use those lights on aluminum trees. This is an ad of 1977 for this new thing called a video cassette recorder. It's a VCR, and it's a steal, I think. It costs $995. And it has a 24-hour timer. You can program up to 24 hours in advance. The interesting thing about this is that as early as the very early 60s, TV Guide talked about recording machines that they thought eventually be coming around, but they never foresaw them as something you would actually record a show off from. They really did see them just as something you could buy movies and watch in your own home. This is an example of some of the stars of the era. Again, faces you would recognize. This is Diane Baker, who was so familiar on TV back in the 60s and 70s. So when you look at celebrities in issues of TV Guide, you know that those were people who people paid attention to. Here's another one of these fashion shoots we're talking about. This one is Susan Strasberg, the daughter of the famous acting coach. I wonder if she was trying to think, what is my motivation for looking this way? This is Carol Lindley, who is up and coming. She had done some plays. She's doing some movies and TV, so she's big enough that she's doing a pictorial for TV Guide. Now, I understand that not long after this, she did another photo shoot for a magazine that did not emphasize clothing, but I don't know anything about that. I just have heard about it. This is Cher from 1968. You can see even back then she was a flamboyant dresser, but this is probably as good an example as you'll see of the way fashion was in the late 60s into the early 70s and how TV Guide is showing you what's hot out there. Maybe they don't expect you to dress that way, but they want you to be educated in knowing what people are dressing like and how things are. This is Raquel Welch behind those Foster Grants. And to paraphrase something Dean Martin once said about Raquel Welch, there are two of them. Of course, I'm talking about lenses. So that, and again, you can't think of anybody better to do something like this in the late 60s than Raquel Welch. She's all over the place in TV and the movies. I find this interesting because this is an article from 1959. It's about religion on television, and the viewpoint here is that television is going to be a great boon for religion. It's going to help various religions get their message out to the public, and that it's something where TV and religion can partner together. And you've got all these shows on TV. You've got Life is Worth Living with Bishop Sheen. You've got Billy Graham, The Catholic Hour, The Eternal Light, Look Up and Live, Lamp Unto My Feet. These are all religion shows on network television. And then you've got syndicated shows besides. And even though we have entire cable networks devoted to religion today, religion in the mainstream on a network program, forget about it. This is a great example of that, I think. Just a quick look through TV Guide Christmas issues of the era. 1958, you've got a star, you've got a church, you've got all the iconic symbols of Christmas. 1959, you've got the bow. The issue is actually a present, has the tag on there, Merry Christmas. 1962, TV Guide even changes its iconic logo in the corner from red to gold so that it'll be more festive. Merry Christmas. 66, you've got an angel. In 69, you've got the dove. I think it's a dove. And while the dove has a religious connotation as the Holy Spirit, it also has a connotation of peace. And in 1969, that's something that's on a lot of people's minds, peace or lack thereof. By 1979, which is 10 years later, you notice something. You notice there's no religious iconography here. You also notice it doesn't even say Merry Christmas. It just has Santa, which is a nice, safe Christmas symbol. But the inside of the issue, it doesn't say Christmas anymore as to what day of the week it is. So it's removed most of the Christmas trappings from the issue. By 1989, as you can see, these are all Christmas week issues. Doesn't even mention Christmas. You've just got a regular issue. You got Murphy Brown in 1989, Now and Again in 1999, The Year in Cheers and Jeers in 2015. You may have an issue early in December for Christmas, but it's holiday, it's not Christmas, and it's like a holiday viewing guide to different shows that have a loose connotation for the year, but completely different in attitude, again, pretty much absolutely mirroring what's going on in the culture. Now, I mentioned letters to the editor, and I want to go through some of these. And I don't know how well you can see them all, so I'm going to read them, but I'll try to be quick because I don't want to run over time with these. It shows us again how people thought, how things have changed. This is from April of 1960. Bob Hope has lost a fan. I, for one, am disgusted and not amused by his frequent quips about a man of such stature, character, and high principles as President Eisenhower. He's entitled to sound like a Democrat, but he should make his point at the polls instead of on TV. Don't criticize the president. It's beneath you. 1961, this issue had two separate letters about bad language on television, specifically the words hell and damn. And the specific show was Bus Stop, which was a drama on ABC. I shall never be able to understand why I cannot watch an adult program without hearing language like damn and hell. Some of our writers must indeed be in a very serious situation if they can find no better way to get their ideas across than by the use of coarse language. One of the things this emphasizes is that TV was the most intimate of entertainment media. You didn't dress up, you didn't leave the house. TV came to you. Television was a guest in your home. And letters like this kind of reflect that. The letter writers are saying, I wouldn't tolerate a guest in my home using this kind of language. Why should I put up with it on TV? Now, the interesting thing about it is that they talked about Bus Stop with the creator of the show, Roy Huggins, who went on to do a lot of other shows as well, one of the great writers and creators. And he said, well, the reason you hear this kind of language is because this is the way people talk. You can't do an adult drama without using adult language. But then he adds something very interesting at the end of the interview, which is, of course, that language isn't essential to the story at all. And I think that's the point that these letter writers were getting at. It may be realistic, but you can tell the story without it. Wonder how this person feels. People usually resented having their shows interrupted for bulletins like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, oh, for the day when there will be a fourth network. Now, I can't figure out if they want more news or if they just want the news off of their channel. And so I don't know how they felt about Fox and CNN and C-SPAN. This, I love this. These next two letters you could have today with absolutely no change in them. It was in reference to an article that Neil Hickey had written about the right wing's predominance on radio and television. First letter. The article states that radicals of the left have no voice on American TV and radio similar to that of their rightist opponents. Who does Mr. Hickey think he's kidding? We're fed left-wing propaganda almost constantly via the press, TV, and radio. The next letter. Congratulations for shedding light on those oafs who pander to every base fear and who do not know the meaning of truth. Wouldn't have to change a period in there, and you could do it today. The suggestion is not that the networks are filled with liars, but rather with liberals. Not that they conspire to slant news, but that they all share a point of view and consequently cannot help but bias their presentations by their very honesty. This was written in 1970. Eric Severide, the news commentator, had defended TV News. TV Guide devoted their entire letters section just to Severide's article. And the editor pointed out that the letters ran about 2-to-1 against Severide and in support, more or less, of what this letter writer would have said. Now, there was an article in TV Guide, I think it's Richard Gaiman's, writing about black and white television. You have more black entertainers coming onto television. This letter was not signed. It's from Birmingham, Alabama. When a Negro entertainer appears on our screen, we immediately switch stations. We are not against Negroes who can act, but are against putting them on as models and singers. And I think it's ironic. Notice the date of the issue of this, July 4th, 1964. Here's another letter from that issue. The people in the South do not like Negroes on TV. If Negroes start getting on all those TV shows, there are going to be a lot of shows dropped. The Defenders, for example, is a show not many people watch in the South. Now, this person was from St. Augustine, Florida. They're not really saying that it's either a good or bad thing. I think they're just pointing out what they see as a reality of the situation. This is the way the South is. Now, the next letter here is, I'm a white woman from a southern state married to a Marine. Integrated, glad to see Negroes in the television industry. We're overlooking a great treasure of talent by harboring prejudice against them. This not only it comes across as an enlightened letter from somebody, but it also points out how people feel about the military. You know, it figures that this is the wife of a military man who writes this. The military somehow is above all these things at this time. That doesn't change until Vietnam. This letter is from Godfrey Cambridge. I don't know how many of you remember him. He was a black comedian. Very funny letter. It's on 2 pages. I'm afraid I was quoted out of context in that letter. I have never been nuts enough to contend that Negro actors are late for work because cab drivers discriminate and refuse to pick them up. I've traveled for work on time by bus, train, rickshaw, and coolie with badly sprained back. I weigh 260 pounds, you see. And I wonder, by the way, if he could say coolie with sprained back today. He might even come into some heat for that. But if Negro actors do have difficulty getting to work by cab, I commend to them the Cambridge Rent a White plan, whereby they can rent a white person for $2 per hour to hail and hire their cabs for them. I guarantee arrival on time. Now that I've solved this problem, when do I get my own TV show? It's a funny letter, but TV Guide did believe in equality on television, and I'm not a bit surprised that they would run something like this, but I wonder what kind of response that got. Jack Parr for the course. He hit an all-time low with 2 young, no-talent comedians he presented in a backseat sketch supposedly typifying teenage deportment. It was straight from the gutter. You know who those 2 no-talent comedians that you're never going to hear from again are? Yes, exactly. Mike Nichols and Elaine May. I have 3 little children, and I don't want them growing up in a world where if you don't agree with another human being's views, you shoot them down. This letter comes in the wake of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, which was less than 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King. Oh, I'm sorry, that just skipped ahead. I apologize. Let me, okay, this is where we're at here. We're talking about the Doan Report, which is where TV itself is starting to take a look and ask the question, are we doing something wrong? And one of the things Doan points out is that there are dozens of TV shows over June, July, and August that are being taken off of the networks because they're worried about the content of them. They're worried that it's too violent. And the Louisville Times, for example, accused television of being a root of the problem of violence. And so Lyndon Johnson says, wonders whether the seeds of violence had been nurtured by TV, movies, and the news media. This is Merrill Panet, the editor of TV Guide, who's usually the one that you read in the editorials in the front of the magazine. Violence certainly is a basic element of drama. We know the argument that Macbeth is full of violence too, but that violence is necessary to the plot, not something forced to titillate the audience. Interestingly, back in 1961, Mickey Spillane, the creator of Mike Hammer, wrote an article on the very same subject when The Untouchables was being criticized. What did he say? Our problem is not too much violence, it's the type of violence. We need to concentrate on violence that means something, not just violence for the sake of violence. I'll just skip through some of the rest of these because I am getting a little low on time. But the FCC, this is an interview with the head of the FCC, and what he points out is people are worried about sex and violence. There's nothing we can do about it. I'm sorry, folks. But he's trusting that viewers and station managers operating in the public interest will be a wise judge of what should and shouldn't be on TV. From 75 to 92, it always keeps coming up. Violence. Hollywood fights back against special interest groups on violence. Is violence battering our kids? What happened to family TV? This is a great cover because this is from Leave It to Beaver. What happened to family TV? Sex, violence, and lewd jokes have invaded early evening viewing. Why? Maybe it's because of the covers TV Guide was showing, like this one from the past week. The week before that issue comes out, this issue comes out. Now, I'm not picking on this particularly because, again, X-Files is hot, Gillian Anderson is a big star, but the point is that it's asking a question already answered, more or less. Sex, violence, that's just the family hour. Again, 2003, still asking the very same question we were asking in 1961. 2017, this is on TV Guide's website, talking about, we're looking at the best sex on TV of the year. Our crack crew of researchers looked through every bonk, poke, and bow chicka wow on television from the year. And the list includes boy, girl, 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 trans boy, girl, boy, 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 demigod, aunt, nephew, and teen boy and pillow. So you can criticize this. The point is, this is entirely in keeping with what culture's like. Perfect demonstration of it. This is the last section I'm going to go through quickly. This is from these TV teletype things that they used to have in the front and back of the issue. They were printed on yellow paper. You kind of had this idea of gossip, of coming attractions. If you want to exchange your black and white set for a color set, they'll offer, CBS will offer you $400 for your black and white set to get you to buy a new color TV, December 1955. CBS is talking about the host of their morning show, Dick Van Dyke, in December of '55. Think about that for a minute. We could have had the CBS Morning News with Dick Van Dyke. Fred McMurray is going to wind up as Perry Mason if they can sign the contracts. Dotto, a quiz show weekdays at 11:30. It's so popular they're already going to do a nighttime version of it. 2 months later, Dotto's off the air. It's not because the ratings have fallen. It's because they had one of those inconvenient things where one of the contestants waiting to go on the show found a notebook backstage that belonged to another contestant that had all the answers to the questions that contestant was going to be asked. That's the start of the quiz show scandal. Dotto is the show where it first started. Another Dick Van Dyke mention, Double Trouble. That's what they thought the show was going to be called. They've already signed Maury Amsterdam and Rose Marie. I wonder when Mary Tyler Moore is going to come in. A new science fiction color series called Star Trek with Jeffrey Hunter as a spaceship captain. Well, we know he did the pilot, but he didn't progress any further from that. Don Adams also has a pilot. It's called Get Smart. I wonder how those went. CBS has a new Peanuts cartoon for Halloween. It's called It's the Great Pumpkin. They're wondering if it's going to be a success. Don't worry, it will. 2-hour version of Heidi is going to be on NBC. I think that a lot of you know what this is about already. November, the score is New York 32, Oakland 29. There's 1 minute and 1 second to play. Poof, the network goes from the game to Heidi. Because of a contractual obligation, the Raiders score 2 touchdowns in the final minute to win the game. It becomes the most famous regular season game ever played. They had no idea when they wrote about this that Heidi was going to become as famous as it did. Ed Asner has a new show coming up. It's going to be a newspaper show, part comedy, part drama. He talks about the writers. He's a little nervous about being the star of a show. Two things. It never mentions what the title of the show is going to be, and it never mentions that his character is a spin-off from Mary Tyler Moore. I just find that intriguing for more reasons. Finally, I wanted to end on a really light note because some of this has been kind of heavy. This is the first television star, Felix the Cat. And he was, a papier-mâché model of Felix the Cat was used because he was black and white. It provided a good picture for testing, and the lights in the studios were incredibly bright, and because he wasn't alive, he wasn't going to be bothered by the heat. Now, as far as I know, they never did an article on Felix the Cat in TV Guide, but he's all over the place in the late 50s and 60s with his cartoon show, so I figured that nothing on TV Guide would be complete without talking about the world's first TV star. So again, my book covers part of this. It's about culture and television. Part of it is about TV Guide, and there's a lot more in it in this tenor. And I blog about this. I have a website that has 4 articles a week on it. It's www.itsabouttv.com. I review TV Guide every week. I take a look at a day of programming from that issue every week, and we find out more about other classic TV blogs and what they're talking about. So it's a labor of love for me. I think that if you've enjoyed this talk, you'll enjoy this. I'll be downstairs for the entire weekend selling copies of my book or just chatting about TV if you're interested. I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions, but I'll be around afterwards, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you. Yes?
Remember a long time ago it said, no pay TV, we can't have pay. Can you tell me what some rules are about and so on?
Yes, about pay TV and yep, whether or not you've had cable and pay TV, pay-per-view TV. TV Guide started talking about this around 1959. Because the Los Angeles Dodgers and the San Francisco Giants had just completed their move from New York to the West Coast. And one of the things the Dodgers were doing was setting up a pay-per-view network where their games would be shown on pay-per-view rather than home television. TV Guide was sensitive about cable TV and the idea of paying for TV content from that point on. And they weren't necessarily against it, but they saw this as an educational opportunity. They saw niche TV stations where you could have one station devoted to opera, orchestra, and art, one station devoted to news, one station devoted to education, one station devoted to local things. That was how they saw this evolving. And I think that Merrill Panet, Walter Annenberg, the people who wrote for TV Guide back in the day, quite frankly, I think they would be appalled by what's happened in cable TV, where you have stations like, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody's favorite, but you have TBS, TNT, USA, Bravo, Oxygen, Hallmark. You have all of these stations showing essentially the same programs that they're just rotating from station to station. They've completely lost touch with the niche aspect about how A&E was supposed to be arts and culture, about Bravo was art house movies, about all these other stations being dedicated. That's what the founders of TV, if you will, saw in the future of cable TV, and I think it's gone horribly wrong, and I think they'd be disappointed by that. Yes, yes. Yes. Sometimes within a week, because on a show, I think the best example of that is a show like College Bowl, GE College Bowl, where you had 2 colleges competing in a quiz format, and the winner of that week's show would return the following week to face a new challenger. And if you look at the TV guides that I have from the Twin Cities area where I'm from, quite a few of those issues will have the winner of last week's show in this week's issue. So although you will occasionally see, especially early on, shows being changed or the winner of last week's program, quite often you'll see something that's referred to in the previous week's issues. So sometimes they had a very quick turnaround time on that. Yes?
Other than the program, how different were the TV guides in different parts of the country? Like with the different articles? And what would you say is the nail in the coffin of the TV guide? Like what really sort of ended its preeminence that it had?
Okay. Well, I think, answer your second question first, I think the beginning of the end for TV Guide was probably when Rupert Murdoch bought the magazine, because up until then they had an intellectual content to the issue. They had famous authors, historians. Give you a very quick example. There was a show called The Word. It was a miniseries on CBS, and it was about the discovery of a new book of the Bible that said that Jesus had not died on the cross, and a very controversial story within the book. TV Guide, in order to give you some background on why the Word was an interesting story, had an article about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and what that meant to academia and to Bible scholars. And you wouldn't see that in anything today, but that was quite typical. They would have articles giving background on different things. As far as different issues in different parts of the country, TV Guide first got nationwide attention because they bought out smaller issues that were being done regionally. And so those smaller issues for a while kept some of the local content that had been a mark of what it was when it was an independent publication. But as it got to be a more homogenized issue, you had the shiny section, which was the same everywhere, basically. And then you had the programming section, the rougher paper that had all the listings on it. That would usually have a local aspect to it where they'd be talking about local programs, local stars, things like that. Then something like letters to the editor. In the earliest versions of TV Guide, those letters were all local to the issue. Later on, they became nationwide. Okay, well, I will be available afterwards out here and then downstairs for the rest of the week. So again, thanks very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
The audio content of this presentation, TV Guide, America's Time Capsule, is owned by Mitchell Hadley. All rights reserved. For more information about Mitchell Hadley and his books, visit his website at www.itsabouttv.com.